So welcome, everyone. It's great to see you all. Great to have you with us. And feel free to unmute yourself at any time when we open things up for discussion, and let me know through the chat if you have any questions, or we can, you can also use the, hand raising reaction, and I'll know that you want to talk. Right now we're a small group, so I can keep you all in my gallery view and see that your hand is raised. If we get to 25 people, that's a little harder. And I would need help with that. In honor of the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr., and which was celebrated as a national holiday yesterday, though I believe his actual birthday is tomorrow. And of course, we have a moment of important transition in our country politically, that a lot of us have our eyes on and our minds on. And I want to take this time to think about how we as Jews can learn something from the legacy of Martin Luther King. And what I want to do is open this up as a bigger question too, as to how Jews in general might learn something from great teachers of other religious traditions. And so in thinking about King, I want us to take note of the fact and really take in the fact of his Christianity and his commitment to Christian theology, and the way in which his commitment to nonviolent protest was rooted in a particular way of thinking about Christianity. Now, I think it's a challenge for us as Jews, in part because Christianity has a history with Judaism of anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, supersessionism, and social and political oppression. The idea of learning something from Christianity is understandably challenging, to say the least, for Jews, even though we have good relations with many Christians in the world today. And of course, overwhelmingly Christian churches have distanced themselves from supersessionism. And this is something that Christian theologians are still talking about and thinking about. But again, understandably, to sort of put ourselves in the position of learning something from Christianity might be challenging. So I say that acknowledging the complexity of this, but also to kind of look at it as something that we should adopt as a challenge for us. And I think that King provides an important example of where we might begin to think differently about how we learn from others outside of Judaism, learn from great religious teachers outside of Judaism, in the spirit of precisely the kind of democratic community that King was looking to build. And additionally, that we as Jews, I should say, white Jews who are white, right? That is, not all Jews are white, obviously, but given that Jews who are white, that the ways in which we participate in systems of oppression in this country is something that calls on us to think about what America is from the standpoint of the people who are oppressed within white supremacy in this country, or oppressed by white supremacy in this country. And that obviously Jews have our own experience with discrimination and anti-Semitism in this country and elsewhere, but it's particularly because it's Martin Luther King's birthday that we're celebrating, to use this moment to step outside our normal ways of thinking about America in both positive and negative ways, and to ask ourselves, well, look, how do we see America from the standpoint of someone else? And in particular, in this case, an African-American leader who was teaching and leading a community in resistance to white supremacy and racism. So I want to see those things as our ethical task, right? How do we learn about racism and white supremacy from the standpoint of those who suffer it, and how do we how do we learn great ideas from religious teachers outside of Judaism? How might we incorporate them into Judaism? The trajectory of the text study is really focused on the second one, but the other thing I just mentioned about racism, white supremacy, obviously stands very much at the center of what I'm trying to think about when I read Martin Luther King and I try to learn something, right? I think about the fact that I'm white, I benefit from white privilege, and I need to, in various ways, learn and understand how my experience of America is very different than someone like Martin Luther King's and obviously other Black Americans. So here we go. I'm going to share the screen and we'll start learning. In particular, I did not hit the button I wanted to. In particular, here we go. Okay, you can all see the source sheet. It's not at the top yet, but okay. Okay, so in particular, what I want to focus on is King's idea of loving the enemy, and the way that King uses the idea of loving the enemy in some of his early speeches. And I'll say a little bit about what I know. I'm not a King historian, but I'll say a little bit what I know about the trajectory of some of King's preaching in later years. But it happens to be that some of very powerful language emerges in King's preaching in his earlier preaching, in his earlier activism, where he uses the theme of love of the enemy to talk about the possibility of transformation in American society. And then I want to say a little bit about the source of this concept of loving the enemy from the book of Matthew, from the Gospels, and how this is thought of in Christianity as part of what's often called the ethics of Jesus. And to note, I'm going to just put this out there right now, right? To note that actually, this idea of loving the enemy has often been used to draw contrasts with Judaism, between Judaism and Christianity, which sometimes are used at Judaism's expense, right? That is, in other words, loving the enemy is considered a particularly Christian idea that is not in Judaism, and that sometimes this is used to say something about Christianity's superiority over Judaism. And sometimes Jews actually will adopt that same view and say loving the enemy is not a Jewish idea, but Judaism is sort of better or wiser for not even having that idea. I don't mind discussing that a little bit. My main point here is not to get into into sort of the whole history of those polemics, but I don't want to just sort of easily set them aside either, right? I think it's a very important and deep and rich topic discussed in terms of like the history of Jewish and Christian polemics. But I want to be clear, King, as far as I can tell, and I'm very certain about this, King isn't himself engaging in those kinds of polemics either. And I also want to suggest that we avoid the temptation to kind of engage in that counter polemic and just say, well, that's not a Jewish idea. So King can have his love of the enemy. But at the same time, what I do want to say is that, the Gospels and the teachings of Jesus aren't part of Judaism. And so I don't think it's just a simple matter of, on the one hand, it's not a simple matter of dismissing it entirely as un-Jewish. At the same time, I want to say, if there's something that Jews want to learn from Martin Luther King, it might come by looking at different kinds of texts in our tradition and not just saying, well, we should adopt this idea from Christianity because it's wonderful, but on the contrary, to say like, well, how might we forge something out of Jewish ideas and Jewish sources that does seem authentically Jewish to us and might teach us some of the things that Dr. King is trying to teach us, okay? All right, so with that in mind, I'm gonna point to these two passages, the first of which was from a speech that King gave basically at the conclusion of the Montgomery bus boycotts, right? This is, remember, the bus boycotts of that culminated in ended in 1956. This is what the famous Rosa Parks arrest, sitting on the bus story comes from, and it really culminated in a Supreme Court ruling declaring that segregation was illegal in the bus system. And so this comes from the period. I guess so. The first one comes from the sort of the height of the boycott time, and the second one after the Supreme Court ruling was issued. So King in the first one says, and here he's quoting the book of Matthew probably directly. There's another passage in the New Testament that uses similar language, but I think this is the book of Matthew. There is still a voice crying out in terms that echo across the generations, saying, "Love your enemy, bless them that curse you, pray for those that despitefully use you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. The end is reconciliation, the end is redemption, the end is the creation of the beloved community." So King uses this phrase, the beloved community, a lot in his early preaching, and actually a lot of sort of teaching on King today references this idea of a community, the idea of a community not just being sort of a group of people that you live with or live near, and not just like a demographic group, but the idea of a broader sense of community among all people, right? And the idea of it's beloved, that is beloved by God, to bring in all people into community, even one's enemy, right? And that's really what King is trying to address, right? The next one is even more provocative in a way, because he's very specific about what he means by this, right? So he says, "I believe that the Ku Klux Klan can be transformed into a clan for God's kingdom. I believe that the White Citizens Council can be transformed into a right Citizens Council," right? I believe that. That's the essence of the gospel, right? So he takes these, right, in this very provocative sort of way, and one might say inspiring, though I'm open to hearing, other ways of thinking about it, right? In looking at the possibility that the racists that he is up against, that the people who want to maintain Jim Crow segregation in the South would someday become transformed and be on the right side of things. And that's what he means by the beloved community, right? It is that hope and the possibility that even those who are the sources of oppression, that even those who maintain those systems of oppression would someday come onto the side of righteousness, and there could be reconciliation, right? So when he says the end is reconciliation, the end is redemption, right? The idea that redemption involves reconciliation of all human beings, even with those who hate us and whom we may hate, though I think part of the preaching here, right, of love the enemy is that you should not hate them, right? And that's obviously a very complicated thing. And I think especially what's been going on in our country in general in the last 5 years or so, but in particular in the last few weeks, right? The idea of the possibility of reconciliation obviously seems very difficult to imagine and contemplate. And that's precisely what King seems to be preaching for here. And notice that, and I want to remark on this because we're gonna look at the book of Matthew directly in a moment. But one of the things I want to mention is that King is clearly interpreting the enemy as the white racists, right? That's who he means by the enemy here, right? And not even just particularly political leaders, right? He understands that white racism, especially in the South, but not exclusively, right, is a pervasive view, right? It's a pervasive way of thinking for people and a way of life. And that's what he means by the enemy here. The other thing worth remarking on, by the way, is that throughout the late 50s and early 60s, there were a lot of African Americans involved in the civil rights movement, leaders in the civil rights movement who were critical of Martin Luther King for adopting this sort of language and for thinking this way about reconciliation with white racists. The most famous example probably ends up becoming Malcolm X, for whom Islam, whether it was in his earlier days as a Nation of Islam member, or even later when he becomes connected with mainstream Sunni Islam, right? Islam itself becomes a kind of a choice to embrace justice as the crucial idiom for the struggle for Black rights in the United States, as opposed to love, right? And it's probably an oversimplification. It's certainly an oversimplification to say that Malcolm X only wanted justice and King only wanted love. They both wanted both. But I think that Malcolm X's preaching and his own work was sort of directed at sort of as being different than King's explicitly. But there were others. It wasn't just in the circle around Malcolm X. There were others, the Black Power movement, later on in the 60s, who were critical of King. And I think even at the beginning, right, it may not have coalesced in a particular group, but there were others who were sort of didn't think, let's put it this way, they didn't think this way about white racists. They were not open to the preaching of love towards white racists. But there were many, many followers of King, obviously, who were involved in the civil rights movement with him, who adopted this mentality, right? And we'll say a little bit more about why and why it's important as we go on. But I do want to open it up just at this moment for any questions. And I don't think I see in the chat. Okay, so I see one. Yeah, so a question about Gandhi's influence on Martin Luther King. And the same strategy was instituted in South Africa, and was, yes. So obviously, yes. So King was very deeply influenced by Gandhi. There's no question about that. But it was, and I think actually, Elaine, your question really speaks to sort of what I'm trying to invite us to do, which is to note that King himself was very influenced by a great religious teacher from another tradition, and sought to frame it in deeply Christian values, right? So the commitment to nonviolence as an ethic and as a strategy is absolutely something that King learned from Gandhi. And at the same time, right, King preaches about nonviolence and civil disobedience from a distinctly Christian and a uniquely Christian standpoint by talking about love of enemy. Any other comments or questions? You're welcome to sort of unmute yourself and ask something.
Bill, I sent some, I thought I put it in the chat room. Is it not there? I was trying to ask about the context of King being disempowered and having to adopt something. Would it be the same today in a context where there's greater balancing of power through the voter registration rights that are already going on?
I'm sorry, could you just say the beginning again? Yeah, I just,
sorry.
Sorry.
I wanted to raise the question as to, when was King's adoption of love thine enemy in part motivated by the fact that he was dealing with such an imbalance of power between the Black community and the white community at the time, and whether, so it has to be seen contextually, whether that would still apply today, where, as we've seen in Georgia, having the power to express your views through the polls and voting registration creates a different, power balance.
Right.
Perhaps, I prefer King, but I've been accused of being Pollyannish to say, let's sit down with Mitch McConnell.
Well, let me just ask, I don't want to get too much, I'm certainly not an expert in like the history enough or the legal dimensions of this to comment on like what strategy makes most sense right now, right? So you're kind of asking us to like bring it up to date, but what would be what's the key difference that you see in in terms of, are you saying that therefore nonviolence could be set aside because what? Because someone has more power, or
Well, it's not necessarily, it's not a choice between nonviolence and violence, but rather, focusing on one's own side and mobilizing one's own troops as opposed to reaching across to embrace and sit down with the enemy.
Okay. Well, so this is a good point, right? Which is, I would be careful here, because I don't see if you just look at these two quotations, right? He doesn't say we're going to sit down and actually talk to people here. Now, I'm not saying that he's against that, right? But I think so in other words, let's get back to the question of, what is it that King is actually saying we should do as a result of the ethic of love the enemy, right?
Good point.
Right. So is he saying we should be nice to people? Like, what does that mean? We should be nice to, like, sit down and talk to who, right? And I'm going to get to a citation from later on, from 1963, where he's much more explicit about the strategy of nonviolence. But so what I'm asking us to do here is to just really focus on the theological dimension of the language too, right? In other words, the theology here is one of hopefulness for possible reconciliation. And this is actually, I think this actually speaks to, and I'm not saying, Mark, that you're making this confusion, but I think this speaks to a way in which King's language has sort of been co-opted in a way to dampen the radicalism that he was actually engaged in, the kind of radicalism that he actually represented. In the sense that people, let me just
drop off. So I just
okay, Mark, great to see you. Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Thank you. Very good.
As I think that King is often, people often look to language like this, or really people are looking to the "I have a dream" speech, right? And I'm sure you all know the type of language from the "I have a dream" speech that I mean here, and there I didn't even bother to bring in that text, right, because it's so familiar. But people say, well, King wanted all of us to get along. So all of these kind of all this anger and protests and things like that, that's not what King wanted, right? He wanted people to get along with each other. Of course, that's not really what he's saying, right? That's not at all what he's saying. And so this is really, the way I would put it is that I think when King is saying this about the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council, right? He means that it's more of a statement about God than it is a statement about racists. It's really right, because if I say about another person, well, I think that person is capable of this or capable of that, usually you're making an assessment based on your familiarity with them and their past actions and what you know about their character, right? And sometimes you might say about somebody, yeah, I don't really trust them because of past mistakes or past actions and what I know about their character. King isn't saying, well, I know those white people and I've spent a lot of time with them and I think they can change, right? I think they've got it within them to change. They're basically decent people at heart. I don't think he's really saying that. I think he's really saying that he believes in this Christian vision of the kingdom of heaven, right? And he really believes in this, right? He talks about, the reconciliation and redemption at the end of time. That the fact that kind of kingdom of heaven is possible means that we have to believe in the possibility of this transformation. But he's clearly using it, I think, to support this ethic of nonviolence as well, right? And that's really the key thing, is that it's nonviolence. It's also civil disobedience, but as we'll see in a little bit. But the ethic of nonviolence for King demands that we set aside hate, and it's precisely this ethic of love of the enemy that he believes in his preaching will allow his Christian parishioners, right? His Christian parishioners who are fighting for civil rights to set aside their hatred in order to protest in peaceful fashion in the face of tremendous intimidation and threats of violence against them. And I think that's crucial to understand about what King is doing, is that, and I don't think he means it as just a kind of strategic thing where he said, well, I'm going to preach, like, it's not just a form of psychological persuasion. It's a deeply held theological and ethical commitment to love of enemy. And he's saying, look at this, look at what Jesus is saying. Jesus says, love your enemy. What greater enemy do we have than these white racists? And yet we are called upon to love them. What does that demand of us? And I think that the explication of that is the strategy of nonviolent civil disobedience. Because to go into violence, to transform their strategy into violence would violate Jesus's commandment to love the enemy. So I want to shift here and go into Matthew chapter 5 and just look at it somewhat briefly. And we're not going to read all of this text, but this is from the Sermon on the Mount, which one of the famous texts of Western civilization. And here in verse 17, I'm going to look at verse 17, 18, and then I'll look at just a few more bits of it until we come to love your enemy. So in verses 17 and 18 here, Jesus says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law, which is the Torah, or the prophets. I have come to abolish them. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter nor the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. So again, this is a verse that has a huge role in talking about Christianity and Judaism and Christian supersessionism. I don't want to focus too much on that right now. The key thing is that when Jesus says, I've come to fulfill the Torah, the verses that then continue in this part of the Sermon on the Mount are an indication of what he means by that. So what he does in this section of the Sermon on the Mount is he takes things that are commandments from the Torah and he offers a kind of additional teaching, right? And actually, there's a great Hebrew term for this, which is midata chasidut, which is the quality of piety, right? In other words, these are the extra legal or the sort of supererogatory is a good term for it, right? The supererogatory element of all of these commandments. And he basically says, well, you know the commandment as this, I'm going to teach it to you to go even further. And they all have this kind of structure, right? So if you look now, I've given you a couple of these examples, and I just want to look at one more, at one of them before we look at love of enemy. You have heard that it is said, you shall not commit adultery, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Okay, so now here we have a commandment from the Torah, you shall not commit adultery, and you have Jesus giving an additional element to this that makes it far more pervasive and demanding as a commandment, which is you shall not lust for a woman in your heart, and that's considered adultery, is what he's saying, right? And a lot of you may remember Jimmy Carter in general, but this specific story that he was asked about committing adultery, and he said, I've only committed adultery in my heart, or something like that, right? Which even in this very Christian nation kind of felt probably a little odd to a lot of people, or maybe just, just to the coastal elites, such as they were in the late 1970s. But that was that was how serious he was about the gospel, and that's how he felt he had to answer that question, right? In other words, adultery wasn't enough to be responsible for it. He had to acknowledge the sin in his heart as well. So that's the kind of thing that Jesus means, I think, here by coming to fulfill the law. That is to take the Torah, to take the commandments of the Torah to a greater extent so that they find real fulfillment in a kind of intense ethical demand, right? So now we'll go down to verse 43 here, right? You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be the children of your Father in heaven. All right. I'm just going to keep it right there. Here's the really interesting and sort of challenging part of this verse here from the book of Matthew. We know that the Torah talks about love your neighbor as yourself. We're actually going to look at that verse in a moment. But it doesn't say hate your enemy in Leviticus chapter 19, where it says to love your neighbor. So when Jesus says, you have heard it that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, where does the hate your enemy come from? Right? And there doesn't seem to be a place in the Torah that talks about hating the enemy. There are enemies of the nation, but I'm not sure and this is the second point really, is I'm not sure that enemy here really means a national enemy, right? It doesn't mean the country over there who is attacking you or you're at war with. In this context, it may mean the enemy probably means something more like someone who you're a rival with, someone who's done something to hurt you. In other words, someone who's within your larger sort of social and political context, lives within your city, someone that you know personally, but someone who acts as a kind of rival to you, or maybe they're a business rival, maybe they've just your rival in some sort of political context, someone who it might be natural for you to want to dislike, and that you develop an attitude of hate towards that person. And maybe you think of them as being unjust or evil in some way, and that might be acceptable also. But again, it's not clear where it says to hate your enemy. So there's a lot that requires interpretation here, and yet we have then the famous ethic of Jesus: love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. Okay, since we've just done the book of Matthew, any questions? I'm looking at the chat. Any questions about any of this? And feel free to unmute yourself and chime in. Okay. So at this point then, what I want to do is think a little bit about how we might learn from this within Judaism, right? In other words, how might we learn something about what Martin Luther King was teaching, and how we might incorporate this into real Jewish ideas, Jewish texts, and Jewish values. And I think the thing that, and this goes back to what I was saying about the way in which King is often misunderstood. And I want to focus on the sort of the missing piece here that's often, I think, misunderstood. And then I'll turn to a text of the Torah, and then a text of King, and then we can keep learning a little bit. But I think this is when King is read as saying loving the enemy means searching for reconciliation or simply trying to get along, right? In other words, reconciliation at the expense of justice, or getting along at the expense of agitation. That's clearly not what King is calling for. And yet he's often invoked in precisely that way. And so I think the element that is often overlooked, and that King himself maybe doesn't speak to directly. Maybe he takes it for granted, or it's not as part, it may be something that he just didn't think of as sort of clarifying as part of his ethics. And, goodness knows if he had been given the opportunity to live longer, perhaps he would have had the chance to explain it further. But the element that's often overlooked is that the purpose of nonviolent protest is to point to injustices committed by other people. So whatever love of enemy means, it doesn't mean saying, well, you've committed an injustice against me, but I love you, so forget about it. There's just no way to read King as meaning something like that. And it just so happens that there is a text in the Torah that suggests an ethical approach to love that suggests exactly, that deals in a way with that problem, right? That deals with the connection between love and being harmed by another person, right? Or at least the way I read it, it deals with that, right? Maybe it could be read a different way, and I'll open us up to that. But I certainly think that that's one way of possibly reading. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 17 and 18. Now, the end of verse 18 is a passage that many people know. It's love your neighbor as yourself. And it's actually, right, love your neighbor as yourself, I am the Lord, which gets into sort of the theological dimension of neighbor love. That's not my main point here. My main point is to look at what's in verse 17 and for us to consider a way of reading verses 17 and 18 together as expressing a kind of series of ideas that are interconnected to each other. Right? So the first is, you shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. I'm just going to read it in Hebrew briefly, and then I'll read the English translation, right? Lo tisna et achicha bilvavecha, hochiach tochiach et amitecha, velo tisa alav chet. Lo tikom velo titor et bnei amecha, ve'ahavta l'reyecha kamocha ani Adonai. Okay, so you shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. Reprove your kinsman, but incur no guilt because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your countrymen. Love your fellow as yourself. I am the Lord. Right. So the word there, fellow, is often translated as neighbor. Right. And I want to focus just on verse 17 then for a moment. Right. So what is verse 17 about? Now, the way that verse 17 is read is that there really is a connection between the first sentence and the second sentence. In the verse itself, it sort of appears not as two sentences, it appears as sort of two clauses, but it's translated as two sentences. There's nothing really wrong with that. You shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. Reprove your kinsman, but incur no guilt because of him. All right, so the first one, I think we can sort of understand what's going on here, right? So don't hate somebody among the people of Israel. And clearly the scope here, right, is the people of Israel. And now it says, reprove your kinsman, but incur no guilt because of him. Well, that's a little unclear perhaps, right? What does it mean to incur no guilt because of him? So one of the standard ways of interpreting this part of the verse is to say that by offering someone reproof, you are, or let me start that one again, is that when you know about someone committing an injustice, whether it's against you or against somebody else, the moment you are aware of that injustice and that you have the possibility to do something about it, and you don't, you incur guilt for that injustice. Not in the exact way, right? This is not a legal formulation, right? This is not about being punished in court. This is more of a broad ethical demand, right? We know we have the concept of, right, every Israelite, everyone in Israel is responsible for one another, right? And that right? Even though, right, or the way that Abraham Joshua Heschel famously put it, right, in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible, right? When there's guilt for injustice in the society, we all have to take responsibility for that in some way. And then the mitzvah, the concrete mitzvah in the Torah, as it's developed by the rabbis of the Talmud, is this idea of tochecha, of reproof, right? That you go to somebody and you reprove them for their injustice, for their evil. And in doing so, you correct them, and you then have taken your appropriate level of responsibility for the injustice, right? Again, it doesn't mean you're guilty of it, though the term here is guilt, right? But you're not directly guilty for it. But if it goes on without your taking any responsibility for it, you incur guilt. One key concept I should just mention that in the way it's developed in the rabbinic literature is that it's important when fulfilling the mitzvah of tochecha, of reproof, that you engage in this reproof with a sensibility about what the other person is capable of hearing and what it'll actually take for them to transform, right? So that it really demands that you consider the psychology of the other person. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't have to sort of avoid hurting their feelings, right? Obviously you want to avoid doing that gratuitously, but at some point, if you have to tell them you've done something harmful, you've done something unjust, even if that creates hurt feelings, you have to do it anyway. But the idea is that you want to do it in a way that they're capable of hearing, right? But then what does that mean, right? And that may very well depend on what the circumstances are and what the actual injustice is, right? In other words, the goal here is not necessarily to get the other person to like you, right? The goal is to get them to stop committing the injustice, right? So you have to think actually in a practical and strategic way of how you might actually get them to stop that injustice. And I want to suggest then that verse 18 is an unfolding of what happens in verse 17, right? And I want to notice that the Torah uses 4 different terms, right? In talking about the other person. And in English, they're translated as kinfolk, kinsman, countryman, and your fellow or your neighbor, right? I'm not sure that those are meant in the original Torah to mean 4 different people. More likely, this is a very poetic text, right? We often overlook this because we're so used to thinking about the mitzvot as concrete legal obligations, which they are, but there's a poetry to the Torah, right? Just think about the Shema, right? Bind them as a sign upon your hands and put them in the front of your eyes, right? There's a poetry to when the Torah asks us to do something of a practical nature. And so I think there's a poetry here too of word variation, of different ways of talking about the people that we live with. And so what we have here is you should not hate, you should directly confront people who have committed evil and injustice. You shouldn't take vengeance against them or bear a grudge. That is, so I think that would refer to after you have called them to account for their evil and for their injustice, you shouldn't continue to bear a grudge. That is, you shouldn't continue to judge them based on their past actions. And you should love your fellow as yourself. That is, you should wish for them more or less what you would wish for yourself, which is that if you made a mistake, that you might be approached about it in an appropriate, helpful sort of way, and that people would not hate you and that people would not take vengeance or bear a grudge against you. right? So loving your fellow as yourself means something like, I wish for my fellow what I would wish for myself, even if I'm not always the person I should be. Okay. Again, I want to just offer an opportunity. I'm going to check the chat for questions or comments so far, and then we'll look at another passage from Martin Luther King. I'm just going to stop the share for a moment if anyone wants to. Couldn't see hands or anything like that. Okay. All right. So this is what King says, and this is sort of how I'm going to go back to sharing the screen. This is how I'm interpreting how we can learn a Jewish ethic of nonviolent resistance from drawing on the lessons of Martin Luther King, but also from some of these verses in the book of Leviticus here about neighbor love, right? How we can think of it as love. I think that's really the interesting question here too, right? There are a lot of great passages in the Torah that talk about speaking up against injustice, but what does that have to do with love, right? So here's King again, and this is from Letter from a Birmingham Jail from 1963. And I read this yesterday with my family, with my wife and my son. We didn't read the whole thing, but we read from excerpts from it as our kind of way of marking King's birthday. And this passage really stuck out to me, and I wanted to include it because I think it really speaks to what it is that I think we can learn from King, and how to then bring it back into values around love and fellowship. So he says, nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. I have earnestly worked and preached against violent tension, but there is a type of constructive nonviolent tension that is necessary for growth. Now it's interesting here. So I probably would have been better saying this before, but I'll say it now that King's Letter from a Birmingham Jail, some of you are probably familiar with this and the sort of background to it, was really directed at a group of liberal white preachers within Alabama, right? Because King's organizing efforts took him to Alabama, to Birmingham in particular, where the intensity of segregation was among the greatest in the South, and it really offered an opportunity to draw a great deal of attention to the severity of Jim Crow segregation, and that this was met with a lot of concern, even by white Christian leaders who were supportive of civil rights and supportive of equality and were against Jim Crow segregation, but they expressed a concern that these more provocative tactics of having sit-ins and marches and confronting the police directly in Birmingham, right? This is where Bull Connor was the chief of police. And so some of the worst, sort of actions against the protesters were taken in these protests around this time period. And so there was a letter written to King by 8 white pastors in Birmingham or in that area of Alabama, and King is really responding to them. But he writes this as an open letter to them, but he then uses it as an opportunity to address the broader category of sort of supportive white liberals who were skittish, shall we say, about some of the more intense tactics, the more more provocative tactics. I use the word provocative kind of more in the literal sense of, right, like they provoked reactions, right? And so there was this worry that the protests and the nonviolent demonstrations and the civil disobedience, right? In other words, putting the protesters putting themselves in a position to be arrested in a nonviolent way would provoke violent reactions that would then provoke violent counter reactions. And I think that was the kind of worry that was being expressed. And this is the heart of King's response to that, right? Now here, he's not framing it in terms of Christian love. He does that a little bit more explicitly in other parts of the letter, but you've already seen what he says about Christian love, right? We've already seen what he said about love of the enemy. And what we see here is that if by the enemy, he means the White Citizens Council, the Ku Klux Klan, ordinary white citizens, the governor of Alabama, Wallace at the time, right? Even if he means ordinary white citizens who support segregation, and of course they did, and they, came out in numbers to jeer and to counter protest, when there were Black children sent to integrated schools, right? There were protests, really horrible, jeering and shouting at the children coming to school, and very threatening, right? A language and demeanor towards these children just coming to school. With all of that, right? If that's the enemy, right? King is still preaching love the enemy, but here he's more strategic, and I think very much in keeping with this ethos of rebuke, right? That rebuke, which is not at the expense of love, but rebuke as an expression of love, right? What we take from Leviticus chapter 19 is to see rebuke as an expression of love, then I think what we can do here is see what King is saying about nonviolent direct action as a form of rebuke. And I think it's very interesting that at the end of that last sentence that I have here, that he says that this constructive nonviolent tension is necessary for growth. He doesn't say change. And I don't think that that's an accident. That he doesn't just mean that we want to change the system. He does want to change people's minds and hearts. He wants change in people. He wants actual people to recognize that they are committing injustice and perpetuating injustice and benefiting from injustice. And it really matters to him that the actions that he's taking are nonviolent as opposed to violent, not just for strategic reasons. And this is the thing I think I want to emphasize, right? For him, it's not just a matter of what path is best to take in order to achieve our goals. There's also a consideration of what is really our goal, right? What is it that we really seek in the end? And again, go back to his language, the end is reconciliation, the end is the beloved community. And if the end really is reconciliation, then the people who are currently our enemies are the ones that we have to imagine as being our neighbors, right? And you can connect this in a broader sense to King's language in the I Have a Dream speech about, about how Black Americans are coming to cash a check, right? That's been long overdue, right? Meaning that their rights and their freedoms. I think King really sees himself as part of America. I mean, that may be sort of a banal thing to say, but it's important to remember, right? That King really sees the others around him as his neighbors, right? They're not just the enemy, they're also his neighbors. That they are, that Black Americans are a part of American society, they're part of American civilization, they're part of the American polity. And they're not just entitled to rights, but they are participating in a society where people have to be able to care about each other and love each other in the sense of wishing for each other what they have for themselves, right? King will also talk a great deal about economic justice in his preaching in the course of his life. And the roots of that desire for economic justice are a desire for the other person to have what I might have, right? Or for me to feel, or on the flip side, right, for me to feel entitled to have what the other might have, should I be the one in a position of economic deprivation. So when King talks about love of the enemy, I think to some degree, he's also saying the enemy is our neighbor. And if they don't act as neighbor now, we want to act in such a way that we can hope for the possibility that they would act as neighbor. And again, that's not a psychological assessment of the people that he sees around him. He's not making a prediction, oh, I know if we do these 3 things, for example, that white Americans will start to like us again. This is a deeply held theological and ethical commitment, that he believes in the possibility of human transformation. And he doesn't know when it's going to happen. He doesn't know for sure that it will happen in his lifetime. And he's not saying, therefore, that we give up claims of injustice for the sake of getting along. What he's saying is, when we engage in the process of fighting against injustice, we have to think of the other person as a person who can be our neighbor. Because they, in a sense, what he's saying is they are our neighbor, whether they recognize it or not. So again, I'll just take a moment to open it up for questions or comments. I'm going to stop share just for a moment, just in case we want to have some time for discussion. I have some more text to share with you, but we can pause it here. Yeah, take yourself off mute, Prue.
It's fascinating it's fascinating to be here. Let me just say that. It's impossible not to be hearing this in the context of what we're facing now, in terms of, certainly, I mean, even before the riot in the Capitol, which I think was my daughter, who is probably kind of your age, and I had a conversation last night, and I had heard somebody, Tim Snyder on TV, say we could witness the demise of democracy in the next decade. I mean, the question was asked by a moderator and he responded in the affirmative. And I was telling my daughter that, and she goes, or we could see this as an inflection point with enormous hope and opportunity to change. And I, what a relief. And I said, and how about if your generation takes that on? Because, we may be getting a little weary about work we feel like we've done around justice and so on. And so what? This could happen. It feels like kind of this powerful time. And to be hearing about the things that King wrote so long ago, and obviously the even longer ago things written in the Torah and the New Testament, is just unbelievably powerful in terms of it all coming together now. And it feels like having that kind of spiritual guidance from both faiths, as far as I'm concerned. I'm a Presbyterian, but to have that kind of guidance now feels urgently important. I mean, I assume you have heard that from other people, but to have heard the voices from before telling us now what to do is very powerful. I guess that's not a question.
No, but that's helpful. And I want to open it up first to be able to talk about what's going on now. I mean, this text study comes partially out of a paper that I wrote, an academic paper that I wrote. And for those who know me, which is a lot of people here, right, you're not surprised that it had a lot to do with Martin Buber, and there's a Buber type of text later on. But I really wanted to focus on King. But anyway, so I had prepared the idea for this paper over the summer, which was already, feeling like a moment of great crisis and an inflection point. And then I gave the paper, I don't know, like it was the Sunday after the Capitol riots, insurrection. So it sort of took on a whole new meaning in a way, beyond what I was even, sort of capable of anticipating, right? So I want to invite others to comment on that or to ask questions around that. Just like, how do we sit with this in the moment, and what are we thinking about?
So that last paragraph just brought me right back to the Black Lives Movement, you know, and it just was right there, you know, with the amount of, you know, and the amount of demonstrations all over the place and making people feel uncomfortable, and the call for it that maybe there would be understanding, because clearly there's a lot more understanding of the position since the summer. Whether there's change, I'm not sure, but it was the beginning. And in some places there may be change. And I certainly think in the minds of a lot of people, they would be more accepting of change, because there's now an acceptance of the whole understanding. So I thought that to me was very, very powerful, that last paragraph.
Yeah. Beautiful, yeah. Well, I'll say that, you know, I think, you know, I mean, obviously I grew up after these events, but kind of grew up with the legacy of those events. And it's very clear, and I imagine it's clear to all of you, and you know, to most people I kind of work with and talk about these things, talk with about these things, is that what a lot of us thought was accomplished looks very different now. And that people were saying, hey, there's all this other stuff that didn't get done that had to now get done. And a lot of injustice still continuing. And it wasn't just a matter of, oh, you know, it'll get better, things are improving, right? When it comes to racial injustice in particular, but with respect to a number of things. So I think the two things I draw from this sort of set of reflections is, what was it that was actually accomplished, say, right? And then how did the forces of injustice kind of reset themselves, right? But also to take note of the other thing is to take note of some of the differences between then and now, and that we are in many ways in a very different moment. And to notice that, to take note of the fact, and this is now I'm sort of veering away from my, you know, my area of expertise, which is, you know, Jewish thought and whatnot, and I'm sounding a little bit more like a political commentator, but I have the floor, so I'll use it, right? Which is that there's a relationship between the citizens and the state that's very different in the mid-60s than there is today, and an attitude about government and centralized government authority that is clearly very different now than it was. And we've known this for a long time, right? The sort of aftermath of Vietnam and Watergate and things like that, as changing people's attitudes towards government, right? And the way that you have things like conspiracy theories and the way that fits into things going on in the world. And that conspiracy theories are not just a property of white nationalism and white supremacy, but you know, they're in other parts of the society. But the way that people are willing to believe certain kinds of things, right? So something like the election, right? The stolen election concept, right? I don't think you really have a parallel to that in the 1960s. And I think that's very important to keep in mind. And that's, so to bring this to the ethical level, right, is not so, you know, I still believe in nonviolent direct action, but to ask ourselves, what is required, either if we think about it in terms of the Torah's teaching about tochecha, of rebuke, to really think about what kind of rebuke is going to reach the other person. And also to what is it that King calls it, productive tension, constructive tension, right? Or he says creative tension and constructive nonviolent tension, right? What's going to create real creative tension? And the things that might have created creative tension back then might not be exactly the same, right? And that's not saying that I'm not abandoning nonviolence in general as an ethic, but we have to think about our own situation much more directly, and then also to realize that any victory we might achieve for the sake of justice might, the forces of injustice might kind of back off, grow underground, and try to, gather themselves in other forms, right? And what do we do about that? How do we sort of deal with that? But that's, okay. Roberta, did you want to chime in again?
Well, when you talk about conspiracy theories, there was, in 1963, there was a major conspiracy about how did Kennedy die. There was all these conspiracy theories about that. But one, you didn't have social media to continue it the way you do it now. And those were, some of them were on the left, Hoover did it, or Johnson. I mean, there were tons of conspiracy theories about Kennedy dying. But I wanted to even go one comment before you said that, like how far we've come. Every time, my husband grew up in Annapolis, and he will tell you that when he grew up, he was the beginning of integration in his schools. Like when he went into middle school, was the first year it was integrated. And this is in Maryland. This isn't the South. Well, it was the South, but it's Maryland. So he very often will tell you, like, look how far we've come. In the 1960s, there wasn't even integration in Maryland and all these different things. So, there was like a start almost in the 60s.
Yeah.
And then it kind of went away. There was so much social programming in the 60s. There was, with all the Head Start and all these things that were meant to really take on, some of the income inequities and stuff, and education inequities. And then it never got to fruition. The Head Start programs now, I mean, I know when I worked in education, they're just not what they were meant to be. Yeah. They're not staffed by the people who were meant to have staffed at the beginning. So it's interesting. I would love to see that. I mean, except for the fact that Republicans took power, but there must be something else besides that explains it.
Right. Well, and that's where King was at the end of his life too, was focusing on, developing the Poor People's Campaign, which has been revived by Reverend William Barber in the last few years. And that's, that's a point at where we are too, is really thinking about poverty and economic inequality as well, in the way that intersects obviously with racial injustice. There are going to be a lot, even on the coalition against Trump they have some different views among themselves about how to handle those issues. And so that's going to be, how do we carry on, sort of dealing with the problems in our society when we don't always agree on those issues, and then what's the creative tension that people can create around that as well. Right. Yeah, Judy, please.
Hi, I just wanted to follow up on a little bit of what Roberta said. I grew up in Atlanta, sort of pre-integration, just a few years. And I went to the temple, and I had Jack Rothschild as my rabbi, and I benefited from his quite forward thinking and dangerous sermons over the years. And I remember when integration was coming, and the complaint was, well, you can't legislate morality. And the idea was, well, kind of you can, because if you put people together, even if it's against their will, they will finally get to know one another and see that they don't have to be the enemy. So that's one thing. But then you look at what we went through, what we are going through, but Black Lives Matter, and we see how far we haven't come, even well-meaning ones of us. And then on sort of jumping to how to rebuke, and given what you said about what's happened in the last couple of weeks, I think one one thing that has stood out for me is basically what Mitt Romney said. You have to tell them the truth, and the truth has to come from people who are maybe not Democrats. People, you know, it should have come from that one person whose name we don't say, but you know, somebody like Mitt Romney saying this, you have to tell them the truth. So that's all I have.
Yeah. Elaine, I see your
Well,
hand
the
up here.
thing is, what I haven't heard, Fox News, Newsmax, um, these those type of stations would not have existed in the 60s. They had the fairness doctrine. So if you had one particular politician talk, the opponent had to be given equal time. Now I can imagine every time Trump called up Fox News and there was a fairness doctrine, and Hillary was given time to respond. This is during the 2016 campaign. And all this, I was outright the propaganda that comes from Fox News, that comes from Newsmax, comes from, One America Network. That did not exist, that would not function, which had an effect upon how people think. I was involved in the campaign locally for trying to reelect our congressperson. And he was facing literally propaganda. He marched I'm talking about Max Rose. He marched supporting a Black Lives Matter march on Staten Island, and what it was turned into by Maliatakis. She's one of the people who voted to not certify Biden. We have a whole problem with her. But, I went around not knowing, who is, pro-Democrat. This is my own area. And I just would ask them openly, and this was September already, because what is your opinion about the November election? Open-ended question. I didn't say anything about my own opinion. I didn't tell them I'm a Democrat until I knew that I'm talking to a Democrat. And you should hear what these people were saying to me. I said, okay, good. Thank you very much for your opinion. And I walk on, So, they were repeating straight things that came from Fox News.
Yeah. Yeah.
The propaganda lies. And one person, she listened like One American Network, that the demonstrations are destroying the city. I'm living out in Staten Island. So these things did not exist at all. We had the massive anti-war demonstrations, which I was a participant.
Right.
And despite, all that, you didn't end the enmity against us,
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, and this is sort of, I think, speaking to, I think, what was Roberta saying before, right? That conspiracy theories maybe are things that have, always kind of been out there, but they can be weaponized much more easily. And also people can coalesce around them much more easily with social media, right? So the way that, you can find friends, but it depends on what friends you're looking for and whether that's a good thing for society or not. I mean, maybe this is sort of, the issue of our time is rebuilding that kind of public trust, right? I guess what I was getting at before was maybe there was a kind of a certain level of public trust that seemed to affect the way people acted around the laws of the government that seems to have been eroded, and that information is playing a tremendous role in that, right? That the sources of information are I mean, I'm interested in this question for other reasons. I didn't expect to be thinking about this exactly right now, but this may be really crucial in thinking about these issues, right? That the question of who is your neighbor when your neighbor is watching, getting their news and information from very different sources, right? And who is your neighbor and who is your enemy, based on that, becomes a real challenge. And how do you engage in rebuke and reproof? And how do you, when you really have to think about where is that person coming from? I wasn't expecting to tell this story. I'll tell you a quick story about political canvassing that I did in Pennsylvania, which got shut down mostly by the pandemic for most of the year. But before the pandemic hit, I was down in Bucks County, and I had a really touching conversation with somebody who, I'll just share, they had a very, I'll just say they had a very like horrific childhood experience. This is an older person at this point, so not I would say not a younger person, but they'd gone through a very difficult experience and were telling us about it, and it was really an open conversation. And I thought, oh, this is really something, maybe this is an open-minded person who might be open to thinking differently because they've really been through like a horrific example of personal suffering. And then a few minutes later, they're telling me about their worry about the imposition of Sharia law, right? And it flipped like that, right? Like it really flipped like that. And I think that's important. Like I think about that guy, and I think about how, there are ways in which I could talk to that person and have like a real conversation, and a way in which that conversation gets shut down because of things that I don't even know what to do at that point. Now, because I was, to be right, this is not such a political session, right? But I was political canvassing, and you all know what I was doing, doing it for, right? Because I was in Pennsylvania last year. But I know that's not at that point as a political canvasser, it's not, you're not going to get anywhere with a person like that, probably, right? But as a human being, right? What's the hope for there to be any kind of commonality? What's the hope for any kind of sense of fellowship with a person like that? And it's there, but it gets taken away. And I think that's something that I think of a lot.
Yeah, well, it has to do, their news sources.
Right. Yeah.
It's, they don't have to go, as I say, they don't have to go on the internet.
Right.
To get these crazy news sources.
Right.
And Fox News is still, not telling the entire truth about what's happening.
Right.
So that has its effect upon how people think,
Right. Right.
One person, I remember, I say when they took, when I could see where they're heading, etc., I sort of, thank them, and I want to end the conversation and go on to somebody else because this is wasting my time. If you're committed one way, forget it. I'm using political science research. And okay, this person wanted to try and convert me. I've had two situations on that. So this person, what TV say? I tell them I don't read TV. I don't look at TV. Period. I read news, and I said, and the New York Times. Oh, the New York Times is, this person was horrendous.
Yeah.
It's you're not, when people have totally different sources.
Yeah. Yeah.
And by the way, it's almost dealing with people, I find as a cult, you cannot, remember, Jonestown and the cult.
Sure.
That this is what we're dealing with. And,
yeah.
You need a psychiatrist to go to deal with them,
Thank you, Elaine. Appreciate you sharing that. Yeah. I want to just take a few more minutes just to show also that in addition to thinking about love as rebuke and thinking about love of neighbor as rebuke, right? There's this whole issue of like, well, what did it mean by the enemy? And again, I don't think what it means, what does Jesus mean by the enemy in the book of Matthew? And I don't think it really means a sort of a foreign enemy, right? We're just talking about enemies as being sort of a foreign entity. I think it means something more like a rival. That seems to be the case. And you see this also in the book of Proverbs, which is a book that comes probably about 200 or 300 years before Jesus, or at least 200 or 300 years before the Gospels are put together and finalized. And from, I just want to look at these two sections from the book of Proverbs. We don't have to look at the Buber. With me, there's always more Buber to do, so we'll do that. We can do that another time. But and these are a couple of passages that are about the enemy in the book of Proverbs, which none of them say love the enemy, but they say some interesting things that I think are helpful to keep in mind, because these aren't necessarily the sort of top things you learn in Hebrew school, and they have they have, I think, important implications for us when we talk about like love the enemy, whether loving the enemy is a Jewish value or not. We should at least remember these verses from the book of Proverbs, right? So Proverbs 24, we have, if your enemy falls, do not exult. If he trips, let your heart not rejoice, lest the Lord see it and be displeased, and he avert his wrath from him. Do not be vexed by evildoers. Do not be incensed by the wicked, for there is no future for the evil man. The lamp of the wicked goes out. Now, I'm not sure that the enemy and the wicked person are the exact same here. On the contrary, they may be different, that the enemy may be a person who's more like a rival. And notice here that there's a kind of karmic idea here. It's not quite the same as karma, but right, don't rejoice in their downfall, because if God is not, right, God might not be exactly on your side, but then all of a sudden, whatever, if you wanted some bad outcome for your enemy, your rejoicing in it may cause the wrath to then turn on you, right? So sort of, I don't want to get into necessarily like, well, what's the idea here of God's wrath? But some sort of karmic idea here that don't rejoice too much. But then it's interesting here too, right? Don't be incensed by the wicked. In other words, don't get angry about the wicked, right? There's no future for them. The lamp of the wicked goes out. And here, there's this expression of deep faith, which it may be hard for us to muster. So I don't necessarily preach this to you as a way of thinking about faith in God, but there's clearly a faith here that eventually the wicked will be taken care of. So there's no point in you getting angry, right? But it does preach a kind of demeanor and a mindset towards evil and towards injustice that I think fits into a way of thinking about nonviolent confrontation as opposed to other forms of confrontation, violent or otherwise. And then I want to point to this one briefly, right? If your enemy is hungry, give them bread to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink. You will be heaping live coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. I'm not sure what it means, heaping live coals on his head. Maybe, you're sort of bringing about some sort of downfall. But it's interesting, right, that if your enemy is hungry, right, in other words, share with your enemy, right? So where it says love your neighbor as yourself, right, wish good things for your neighbor, it seems that the enemy is sort of included in that in some way, right? It doesn't go far as to talk about love here, but it certainly means don't withhold, basic goodness, basic kindnesses from your enemy. And the Lord will reward you for it, right? Again, not necessarily a theology I'm saying we have to maintain. But again, the idea is that you have a responsibility, or you can adopt this kind of mindset in thinking about the other person, even if they're your enemy, that allows you to think about the possibility that they would be your neighbor, right? And I think that at least is I think an important core value that King was trying to preach about, and that we can kind of take in and find our own Jewish language for thinking about. Thank you all for being here. I'm willing to stay for a few more moments, but I'll end the sort of formal time that we have together. And I hope that hope you're staying healthy and safe. and able to celebrate things that there are to celebrate at this time of year. And of course, I don't mean just Tu B'Shvat, but that's coming up too. So enjoy all the things that there are to celebrate in the coming days, and may we all know justice, and may we all know peace. Thank you.
Thank you. And to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you all, especially my my returning customers. So good to see you. Take care.